Linda.
Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 18 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
And we like to dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the front porch.
So, Linny, today we get to interview Meghan Winchell about the book Good Girls, Good Food, Good Fun, the story of USO hostesses during World War II.
Oh, what a lovely, fun book this was. I really enjoyed it. I think besides the good fun, the good food, the good girls, and what you think of as the USO, I think readers are really going to like going deeper because Meghan explores racism, classism, sexism during that time. And Nancy, you and I were not alive during that time.
No.
So this was a learning opportunity for me. And I think readers are going to like learning more about the cultural things that were happening and how the USO responded and what they did and how the government worked together as far as endorsing the USO, but then what the USO was about.
Yeah, it's a great book. And Meghan is a great educator because she really explained to us very clearly her thoughts around the book and around the topics that we bring up. She's very eloquent. I guess this is not a surprise because she is a professor of history at Nebraska Wesleyan University. She's chair of gender studies and the coordinator for the Capitol Hill internship program that sends Nebraska Wesleyan students to Washington, D.C.
Woohoo!
Yep, to be interns. In addition to this book, Meghan's also co-edited a great volume called Buffy in the Classroom, Essays on Teaching with the Vampire Slayer. Meghan also taught at the University of Tartu as a Fulbright scholar, and her teaching fields include African American history, U.S. women's history, the history of World War II, and popular culture. Meghan appeared on the PBS documentary USO for the Troops, where some of the other commentators were Jon Stewart, George W. Bush, Brooke Shields, Jay Leno, Anne Margaret, Raquel Welch, and Colin Powell.
My goodness. When you read her book and you see the footnotes, you'll know that she's a smart lady, and she is. And she stopped by our front porch, Nance. So let's get to her interview.
Great. Welcome, Meghan.
Welcome to our front porch.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, we just loved your book. We have done a podcast on lots of different kinds of books, but this book was fun, and I needed a fun book.
Good. I'm glad.
I learned a lot about the USO. I did not know very much going into it. Personally, I really liked the anecdotes that you included in it. Lots of fun stories, and I would imagine that the women had a lot of fun telling you and writing about these stories.
They really did, and they were very generous with their memories. I think I was maybe one of the first people to ask them about their experience at the USO, and definitely their war years experience. So we had a great time, and I got to meet some wonderful people, a lot of couples actually who had met at the USO. So
we love that.
Yeah, it was fun.
I love that. Yeah, I really love that. What kind of drew you to write about this group? Were you somehow involved with them? What led to the book?
Well, I was in graduate school at the time, and I actually started out by studying prostitution and the relationships that men had with women when the men were in the military. And so I did a couple of in-depth papers about that topic. That led me to this idea that kept showing up in newspaper articles and journals of the time, this idea of the good girl, and how the person who we always, as a society, had to protect was this good girl. But then there's also this idea that good girls might look good and not actually be good girls. And so I found that really interesting. So that's when I started exploring the USO. And I found what every historian hopes to find, which is that there really wasn't a lot of research done about the USO. So those are the two primary reasons why I ended up digging deeply into the topic.
We can go pretty deep right away then, because I was amazed with this VD stuff. I remember actually when it switched to STDs. I was in that age group, but I can say VD very easily because that was a part of my language. But this whole army deciding they needed to do something to keep these men away from the prostitutes so that they could get through the war and then be able to go home, not have VD and have children and have a wife and have a great sex life, I guess, be able to live on after the war. So I was actually surprised that the military was thinking this way and giving out condoms to people. And actually, I thought being more progressive than I thought they were.
Well, that's because, ironically enough, in what was called the progressive era, a bit earlier in the 19-teens, they didn't do anything other than tell the men, hey, don't have sex with anybody outside of marriage. And they didn't give them any prophylaxis. And as a result, we lost millions and millions of what they called manpower days to venereal disease during World War I. And so because of that, they learned a lesson by the time the US gets to World War II. And they sort of throw out that idea that men are going to just simply do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And they start handing out those prophylaxis, the condoms, and doing those physical exams and court-martialing men and so forth. So yeah, it was a really serious problem. I suppose they did want the men to be healthy for after the war, but that's not really what I found in the documents. Most of what I found was they just needed to win the war. And so they couldn't have these men unable to serve at the time.
So you said something about court-martial. Would they actually court-martial men?
Yeah, they did for this. That was more a threat, but they did do it. The threat worked pretty well, and those prophylaxis stations worked well. So the men did, after they had a sexual encounter with a woman, they would go to these stations and they would undergo a rather invasive hygienic process, where I don't want to get too graphic here, but it was invasive and that would kill bacteria in the area. So that was something that could be done. And then, of course, penicillin becomes widely available to the military towards the end of the war. And that's the number one, saving grace, because once the military has access to it, that's going to be a better way to treat syphilis than some of the previous earlier methods that had been used.
Right. So it is fascinating, though, that the military was really at the head of pulling together the USO, something I did not realize at all. What can you tell us about the origins of the USO?
Sure. Well, the military wasn't really at the head of it. The military endorsed it.
Okay.
And they very much wanted it to happen. It was the project of these service organizations like the Salvation Army, Travelers Aid, YMCA, YWCA, and some others. These are organizations that had done war work in previous conflicts. And so they came together under this umbrella of the USO because World War II was a bigger endeavor. You have so many more men who are serving. So they come together in a sort of a joint effort. And I call them like a quasi-government organization. So they're blessed by the government, but the USO is a civilian organization.
Okay.
FDR endorsed it. The military endorsed it. But one of its virtues, and one of the reasons why people really appreciated the USO then, and I think today, is that it is made up of civilians.
That's a really important distinction in terms of the decisions that were made and the policies and pretty much everything else that we're interested in talking to you about the racism, the classism, the sexism, and some of those topics, that this was set by a civilian board, not a governmental organization.
Yeah,
that's correct.
That kind of clarifies some things for me. First of all, I decided that I could be a USO hostess back in the day.
Good.
Because I asked my sister, would you have been a whack or a wave, or what would you have been? And we decided we would probably both be hostesses. Well, you would have been in college, Nancy, but I'd have been looking for a man. And I would have been influenced, I think, by the amount of ladies that did go, because they, the women came because that's where the men were.
Right.
So there's, dancing right there and fun and socialization right there where the men are. So I think I would have loved being a junior hostess, not the old lady who has to monitor things.
The old 30-year-old.
Yeah, the old 30-year-old that is not sort of seen as this. I don't know that I want to say sex object, but there is sort of that attraction. You had to have the ladies come in to get the men away from the bars and the prostitution and the carousing.
That's right.
And provide a gym or something where they could get together and have something to eat or drink or dance away. So one of the interesting parts of this whole USO for me was the wax and the waves. It sounded like it was originally, let's get the young ladies out for the young men. And then all of these issues cropped up. And one of those was, well, what do we do with the ladies who are in the military?
Right.
Because if they come, they're going to steal our men. I got competition. I mean, I'm only 18, 19 years old, so
Sure.
I might look at it that way.
Yeah.
And what do we do with that?
Well, it's a little bit of, there's some competition between the USO hostesses and wax, or at least there's a perceived idea maybe they could be competition. But more than that is what the wax and the waves represented, which is something that the military was still getting used to, this idea that women were wearing uniforms. And I really think that what was going on is that those women who were in uniform weren't considered quote unquote real women. They were not there for the male gaze. They were working and they were wearing, other than it being a skirt, the same uniform as the men. And, one of my favorite quotes is this idea that women who were in the service could not be in the clubs. This is in the fancy, I think this is in Washington, D.C., the Stage Door Canteen. They couldn't be there because they were in uniform, and that would remind the men that they're in the military, and the whole point of the USO in part is to distract them from being in the service, which I think is silly because the men couldn't get in the door without wearing their own uniforms. They can't forget that they're in the military. So really what it comes down to is who gets to be called a woman and who doesn't get to be called a woman. And the USO wanted to create a space for servicemen and civilian women. And they, some were welcoming to wax and waves, but a lot of them, as you saw in the book, were uncomfortable. They just didn't know what to do with this whole new group of female soldiers, which at the time is kind of an oxymoron. How can you have that particular combination?
Yeah. The USO really reinforced a lot of traditional gender stereotypes. So the idea of a woman in the military really went against that. It was a tumultuous time. Can you tell us a little bit about how the USO did reinforce those kind of gender stereotypes?
Well, yeah, because the USO is the place that you want to go to do your part for the war effort if you're not sort of brave enough or non-traditional enough to go out and join the military. That's a big step for a woman to join the military. And there's all kinds of assumptions about women who join the military that come with it. And if you're not going to go be a Rosie the Riveter, if you're not going to go work in a factory, but you still want to contribute, the least threatening to a woman's identity, the least threatening thing for them to do for the war is to go dance with servicemen, hand out cookies, bake cookies. So this is part of the reason why the USO was attractive to women who aren't interested in breaking boundaries. So it's sort of two things at once. The USO is reinforcing traditional gender roles, but there are women out there who want those gender roles to be fulfilled.
Sure.
So those sort of two things work together.
Yeah. And there are certainly young women who want to continue in the tradition of their lives. Maybe they're young enough, maybe they're living at home, but like Linda said, they want to have some fun too. And so
Yes.
going out to the USO and meeting handsome young men in uniforms, why not, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I love the part where you said those poor guys that were still in high school or back at home, they didn't join them. They got nothing.
Right.
You know, I work at the gas station, or I'm this or I'm that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a uniform on, so the girls aren't attracted to me. They're all over there with the military guys, you know, that's where they are.
Yeah. Yep.
But speaking of the uniform, one thing that I thought was really interesting was this issue of classism.
Mm-hmm.
Not only in classism of wanting the middle class woman to be the junior hostess,
Mm-hmm.
but also that the junior hostesses weren't really able to see someone else's class because they all had the same haircut. They all did the same uniform, and they all lived in the same place and maybe had access to the same vehicles or the same money rolling and that kind of thing. So the story of the lady that went to the South and saw how he grew up, and the other lady who didn't want to milk a cow for the rest of her life, all these people that, I don't think I want that. So
wasn't it? I think it was Alice who said he expected me to milk cows and be a farmer, and I wasn't going to do that. And Alice was from the South, and so even when I interviewed her, she had a thick sort of upper crust Southern accent, and you got the sense that she came from a wealthier background, and there was no way that she was going to go work on a farm. But yeah, that uniform is fabulous for a man's ego because he puts it on and women throw themselves at his feet, and he, not deliberately necessarily, can become a different person and hide a lot of his own background. So yeah, no, it's a wonderful cloak of respectability, I guess.
And I love this idea that to be middle class is to be a good girl or a good boy. And there is this assumption that women or men from a lower class were dangerous, as if class has the corner on good manners, morality, anything really.
Well, yeah, and those are really old ideas that are just carried through into the war years. Yes, there's a presumption that working class women are looser sexually, that their morals are not policed by their communities in the same way that middle class communities believe they police women's morals. And in fact, they do police them, but that doesn't mean that middle class women aren't engaging in sexual behavior that the community doesn't respect. Even deeper than ideas about class and respectability are ideas about race and respectability. And those assumptions about the hypersexualization of Black women are as old as the founding of the country, older, in fact. African-American women work very hard to gain access to the USO and to shake off those ideas. But the nation as a whole, unfortunately, of course, embraces them. And you could argue through today in some ways.
Yeah. And they also didn't know what to do with the Black servicemen often. And the idea that Black servicemen should not be dancing with these middle class white women, particularly in the South. It seemed like in the North, there were some USOs that were more progressive.
Yeah. So the Philadelphia USO, and I think in the Boston USO, I'm not sure we can call them progressive. They were trying to solve problems. And so what would happen, of course, is if a Southern white man saw an African-American serviceman dancing with a white woman, it would raise all those racist fears of miscegenation or race mixing. Fist fights would break out. And so in larger cities, whenever possible, the USO would try to have a totally separate USO club that would be run by and within the African-American communities in neighborhoods. One of my favorite stories, though, is in Boston, where the USO was really popular. It was at the Boston Commons, and it was really a beautiful place, outdoor dancing, live band, and everything else. But there were no African-American hostesses for the Black servicemen to dance with. And because of the fears of the interracial dancing and all of that stuff, Black men didn't get to dance. And so it was African American women and the Black community in Boston that forced that USO club to include Black hostesses by, I think it was like 1943 or something, which is such a great story. And I argue that Black women were not going to let only white women be able to contribute to the war effort in this way, because as we were talking about before, it's a fun, respectable way to support the war and the troops.
Yeah, kudos to them for stepping up like that, seeing the need and stepping up. There's a tie between this African American woman and then this classism issue. And I'm glad that you brought that together, because they were working. They were working, most of them. So they had a lot to do rather than cook cookies and cupcakes all day. Maybe they didn't have as much money to be able to buy all these ration goods and put the money out there to do all of that. Whereas I think you said in the book, the junior host is sort of that classic person. A lot of them did work, but they had better jobs.
They needed to work. They needed an income, but most of them were middle class, and there's an idea that they're not going to work after they get married. Whereas in the African American community, women so often have to continue working after they marry because men's incomes are lower. Black men's incomes are lower than white men's. So yes.
So it made it hard for them. It was an effort for everyone. I can see how it would be hard to work all day and doing some menial jobs and then to run home, take a shower, freshen up a bit, and go out and volunteer at night. So it was a commitment for people.
It was. But again, this is a different, we don't want to romanticize the war era, but there was a desire to serve. Everybody wanted to contribute. It's a total war. So all the resources at home are designed to support the troops, whether they're still in the US or they're abroad. So you had that extra bit of energy. Most people did, to go and contribute in some way.
Yeah.
I was surprised at the racism in the North, and also not just the African American, but you also brought in Mexican Americans, the Jews, which I didn't realize. Again, I'm not Jewish. I should have known, but I didn't realize that there were people that were prejudiced against the Jews. But all these people made up our military. We have the Mexican Americans, the Jews. We have a mixed pot serving in our military. And I kind of got the thought of reading the book is that it was kind of going to be kind of like, well, we're going to have these clubs and it's going to be organized. But then we had all these other issues that started popping up for people. Well, what do we do with this group or that group?
Right. Well, and that's why studying World War II is so interesting, because it shines a spotlight on all these problems and differences in society, and the conflict, the war, forces people who don't normally have anything to do with each other to come together. And I would argue that the USO was pretty impressive in the way it attempted to serve a whole lot of different people. And the national USO did give a whole lot of license for people to do whatever they wanted as far as how to run the clubs. And so the policies say don't discriminate, but yet they're not getting into the weeds and actually going to Mississippi and saying, make sure that you do allow African-American people in. And that's because the USO wasn't all that top down. You know, they're just more a name, kind of a label, and they have some policies, but nobody's running around enforcing anything. It's just throwing something together, trying to help these servicemen in a number of different ways. And so as a result, you're going to see racism and all of this classism and so forth, but you're also going to see pushback. And again, that's why I think it's so fascinating to study. It's just a microcosm. The same kind of thing is happening in factories, but there's lots of books on those factories, and there's not that much on the USO.
You were a part of a wonderful PBS documentary called USO for the Troops. You were one of the talking heads, along with a whole panoply of amazing people like Raquel Welch and Brooke Shields. And George Bush
and Jon Stewart. Yeah.
and Jon Stewart.
Yes. At one point, I have something to say, and something like just before me is Jon Stewart and just after me is President Bush. And it was so thrilling. It's like, oh my gosh, what am I doing in there with these two people?
Well, that's such a great documentary. We'll put a link to it on our webpage for this episode. Can you tell us what that was like, that experience of being interviewed for the documentary?
Oh, it was really fun because the filmmakers flew me out to New York City. I'd done some documentaries before, so I know that you want to have a solid color that you're wearing. So I went and bought a teal dress. This is the stuff that's terrible. This is what I was caring about. My mom happened to be able to come up because she lives close by, and she brought me some earrings that she had gotten. And anyway, so I cared about what I was wearing. I can't remember. Oh, it was in a really fancy house on Park Avenue where they were doing the filming. And they kind of prepped me ahead of time and told me a little bit about what they would be asking, because there isn't a lot of other published work on the USO, even though my focus is the hostesses. For that documentary, I was also someone who was giving some of the background for the whole organization. So I brushed up on that. And then I went and I had a great time. They asked me questions. The lights were hot, you know how that happens. Yeah. But I had a whole lot of fun with it. And I was so happy with the final product. And I was really proud. And I think that it raised awareness and brings attention to an organization that is absolutely crucial. One of the things I talk about in the book is that if not the USO, all this stuff wouldn't exist for the servicemen. There's no real significant mental health support during World War II. Nobody's baking home-cooked food for these men. Nobody's giving them, frankly, a shoulder to cry on when they miss their girlfriend or their mom. So the USO provides that human link back to the civilian life. And so I was really happy to be part of a documentary that was highlighting that.
Yeah, I loved all that positive stuff that the USO. Those are the things I really didn't know, that they provided all those services and almost sort of grounded them. Yeah. You know, these are young kids. I mean, I'm almost 60, so lots of people are kids to me. But, you know, you have these 18, 19-year-old kids, and they're away from home maybe the first time. It's a different world. So that poor farmer probably thought, well, all girls milk cows.
Yes.
Like, I mean, well, I would just assume you would milk a cow because all the girls that I know how to milk a cow. So why would I have even brought that up? You're completely in a different culture. There's a drill sergeant yelling at you. I don't know. You have to get up and run 3 miles before you have breakfast. I mean, it just seems like a culture shock to me.
Plus, you could die. You could die.
Yeah. And, and they're here, but they know what's coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. They know what's coming. And the girls did too. And so to provide sort of that grounding for them and that support, I thought was beautiful. But I have to ask you, because Nancy and I asked the question, would you be a Rosie the Riveter? Would you have been a whack or a wave? Or do you think you would have been a junior hostess?
Well, that is a really good question because it's hard to know. The truth is, it would be my own class background at the time that would probably push me into it. So let's say I was more of what I am today, which is middle class. Honestly, I'd like to think that I might join the WACs. I don't know. I think that that's more possible, but I haven't ever been asked that question or really thought about it. Having to dance with a whole bunch of sweaty, nervous 18 and 19-year-old guys from all over the country doesn't necessarily sound like a whole lot of fun to me. Although I love the music from the time period.
Oh my golly. I had to look up the jitterbug.
Oh,
you talked about popular. The jitterbug, and the girls would have to keep dancing all night long because the men outnumbered the women, obviously. So she had to keep dancing all night long. And I'm like, the jitterbug. I think I remember that from high school when they made it to do that.
You couldn't have too much jitterbug. Remember, there's concerns in certain parts of the country. Oh, that might be too hot dancing. Yeah. You know, there could be something. You don't want anything that's too sexual, and so in some places they didn't like the jitterbug, but that doesn't mean that these young couples didn't dance the jitterbug anyway. It was the thing to do, so it's still happening in a lot of places.
So fun.
So Meghan, why the wax?
I think that I like the idea that you would get a skill and that you would be able to travel. And this is more revealing of my personality than anything else. I like how organized it was.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you do this, you do this. I think what made me never think about the military today is all of that really physical activity that you would have to do today. And there was certainly expectations of that. Women had to be really fit, but maybe I just haven't read a lot about that. And so I've looked at my own romanticized idea of what military service would be. But I just think that traveling would be really great and learning a skill.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
I'm just really good at making chocolate chip cookies at that time in my life, so I knew what my role would have been.
You would have been very popular, boy. They appreciated those sweets, anything sweet.
Meghan, after writing this book, do you think the USO fulfilled its mission during World War II to offer a safe, comfortable place for servicemen?
Yeah, absolutely. It did. There's all those issues of class and race and problems, but overall, the few surveys that were done during the time, young men in particular said that the USO was essential for them. It helped humanize them at a time the military was trying to dehumanize them. That's the point, because you have to be able to go out and shoot a gun and that sort of thing. So yes, while other than these surveys, it's difficult to quantify, I absolutely think it provided that connection to home that was necessary. Its mission was not to help maintain gender roles, but it inadvertently does that.
Yeah.
Those traditional gender roles are not disturbed. Far more women are USO hostesses than join the military.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. Okay. What projects are you working on now, Meghan?
Well, over the years, I've done lots of stuff with popular culture, but in my most recent research, I've been looking at the idea, this will connect to what we've been talking about, the idea that women love a man in uniform, which again is pretty impossible to prove. But what I absolutely have found is that the idea that women love a man in uniform is very popular.
Yeah.
So it's sort of just assumed that they love a man in uniform. And you could see it all the way up to today, but the focused research that I did on this particular topic is World War I and World War II. Mm-hmm. And I look at the history of the uniform itself, mostly the Army uniform and how it changed, which I find really interesting. But that is sort of just one part of what I hope is a larger project looking overall at the history of the uniform and how it's changed. And by the Vietnam era, and more recently, how women in the military and in the uniform change or challenge ideas. Like, are women attracted to women in uniform? Are men attracted to women in uniform? Those are questions that I have yet to answer.
Ooh, that sounds very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fascinating. So where can people best stay in touch with what you're up to?
Well, I have a website just at Nebraska Wesleyan where I work, and so they could find information there. I don't have a huge social media presence. It seems to be kind of a dangerous thing for professors these days to have that. So I don't have a Facebook page or anything like that.
Super. We'll link to that on the episode website then.
Okay.
Well, thank you for writing this book and educating us on another role that women played in the World War II, and a very important role. I was fascinated by it. I really was. But I loved the pictures. I said to Nancy, I got this downloaded on my Kindle. So I'm like a third of the way through, because we were trying to figure out when to do. And then I got to like 75%, and the rest of the book was pictures and footnotes and research and all those wonderful things. Loved that you included all those pictures, because then they helped me to figure, okay, this is who we're talking about. And this is kind of the events and all of the things that they did and what it looked like. And I love that part of it, just looking at the pictures you included.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something about that time period too. Those people are no more wholesome than we are, but they look wholesome, don't they?
If you put a dress on, it just
Mhm.
and the guys, they did look handsome,
Absolutely.
Oh.
And I really loved all of the interviews you did,
Good.
and the quotes you included in the book just brought it so much to life. It was really
Aw.
great to read.
It was just a fun book to read. It really was. Thank you so much. And
Aw.
thanks for stopping by our front porch.
Of course, anytime. I had a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, Lenny, I just so enjoyed that interview. I've been a friend with Meghan for quite a number of years, but it was fun really just to concentrate on some of the scholarly research that she's been involved in and to hear more fully about her work on the USO and her thoughts about that organization and the United States culture at the time that in some ways is very similar to us, that we have some of the same challenges, some of the same problems that we really have not cracked. But on the other hand, there are also some things that I think as a culture we have really come a long ways on.
Boy, Nance, I would agree with that. There's so many parallels between, my golly, we're talking about what, 80 years ago?
Yeah.
Am I doing the math right?
I think so.
So many parallels. We've come a long way, baby. We've got a ways to go. But the world has changed and people are more connected because of the way we live now. So some of the cultural things and the norms of different areas of the country doing different things, we're just used to diversity, I guess I'm going to say, more maybe now than before. But there are still isolated areas and there's still people that live predominantly with people of their own race or economics or whatever. But a lot of us live very diverse lives, mingling with lots of different people. So anyway, a great book, loved it, fun read, had a great time with Meghan.
Yeah. Next time on the front porch, we are going to review Tea with the Queen, written by Chrissy Hart.
Oh yes, such a nice little book, a children's book about tea with the Queen. I think Chrissy lived in England, so she knows something about Queen, and she knows something about tea. And so we thought we should end our front porch book club 2021 with tea, because we always talk about iced tea, Nance.
We do. And if you are looking for a gift for a child in your life for the holidays, think about Tea with the Queen by Chrissy.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
You can get that book through our website. I'm looking forward to it. I guess I'll see you next time, Nance. Stay warm.
Sounds good. See you next time, Lenny.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.